I had not flown in years, but my grandson insisted I attend his college graduation in Miami. He booked me on the cheapest red-eye he could find, United Flight 1658, leaving San Francisco at 11:55 p.m., landing a little after 8 the next morning. I am 69 and walk with a cane, so the gate agent kindly pre-boarded me. Row 14 was only halfway down the cabin, right side. My seat was 1 for B-Vol. The window 1 for A showed as vacant on the boarding screen. An empty seat beside me felt like a small gift. I stowed my purse, settled my coat over my knees, and listened to the slow river of other passengers filing past. Most looked tired, hoodies, earbuds, paper coffee cups shaking in nervous hands. When boarding seemed almost done, my man stepped into my row. He did not hesitate or check his ticket. He simply turned sideways, slipped into 14A, and sat. I felt the brush of a heavy wool coat against my sleeve. His head stayed low, chin tucked into a gray scarf. No carry-on, no drink. He folded his hands in his lap, fingers pale against black gloves. I decided to be polite. "Long night," I whispered. He did not move. I tried again. "Miami's warmer than this." "Nothing," I laughed softly, more for myself than him, and faced the aisle. The cabin lights dimmed for takeoff. I expected him to buckle in, but his belt was already clicked. Perhaps he fastened it before I noticed. During the climb, the plane shuddered, the way planes do, like a bus on a gravel road. My seatmate neither flinched nor shifted. His shoulders stayed square, a posture too stiff for someone who planned to sleep. I watched the yellow seat belt sign glow off his coat's dull fibers. Each thread looked damp, almost sticky, as if he had walked through drizzle an hour before. An hour later, the attendants began their quiet service. The cart rattled up the hall, offering water and pretzels. When the woman reached our row, she leaned toward me. "Anything to drink?" I took a ginger ale. She glanced at the window seat, eyes puzzled. "For him." "He hasn't said a word," I whispered. She bent closer to the man. "Sir." No answer. She waited the required beat, then placed a miniature water on his tray table and touched. The cart moved on. I sipped my ginger ale, the bubbles sharp in the back of my mouth. I noticed the man's gloves, no airline reflection on the leather, as if they swallowed light. His breath made no fog in the dim cabin air. I must have nodded off, because I woke to darkness except for emergency hour markers and a faint movie glow from 3 rows ahead. My watch said 3:07 a.m. My neck was sore. I stretched a little and felt the man's coat sleeve again, pressing gently against my arm, as though he had leaned my way while I slept. The pressure was constant, not the accidental bump of turbulence. I drew back, but the armrest pinned me. "Sir, could you give me a little space?" No response. I pressed the call button. Nothing happened. Perhaps the bulb had burned out. Instead of waiting, I decided to use the restroom. I rose carefully, stepped into the aisle, and shuffled toward the rear galley. Behind me, the man did not move. The restroom line was short, 2 teenagers and a businessman waited. I glanced down the hall from that angled seat 1 for it looked empty. Only a bare headrest caught the blue light. I frowned, tilted my head, and squinted. Still empty. A cold thought slid through me, maybe he had followed me. Yet I had heard no footsteps. When I returned, 1-4A was occupied again by the same unmoving shape. I eased into 1-4B, heart thumping like a hand on a door. I tried to rest, but kept listening for breathing. Nothing. Only the steady drone of engines and the occasional clink of glasses in first class. As dawn approached, a faint pinkage appeared through the window across the aisle. Cabin lights brightened. The lead attendant announced we would begin our descent soon, and asked everyone to raise their seatbacks. The man beside me stayed rigid. I focused on small tasks, folding my blanket, straightening my purse strap, until the wheels clunked down. We landed at 8:11 a.m., rolling past bright Florida grass. Passengers unclipped their belts, stood there stretched, retrieved bags. I waited for help with my cane. When I finally rose, the man still sat, hands folded, gaze down. I touched his sleeve, meaning to say goodbye or at least excuse myself. The wool felt colder than the window glass. I shuffled past and exited inside the jet bridge. My uncle is not a man who likes tall tales. So when he said he carried one memory that would stay with him until the day he dies, I knew it was serious. He nodded, smiled a little, and told me to warn anyone who reads this that it is only the voice of an old man and that some parts might sound impossible. He started by explaining how he finished school at Fordham University in 1974. Back then, good work was easy to find. Firms wrote letters and even phoned students asking them to come in. He didn't want a life at a stuffy desk. So, he waited for something that felt right. The moment came during a Thanksgiving flight to visit my aunt. While looking down at the shining dots of planes sliding across the night sky, he fell in love with air traffic control. He liked the steady voices, the moving lights, all of it. By his 27th birthday, he had passed every exam and was allowed to work without another controller standing over his shoulder. The first posting was never a choice for rookies. Instead of a famous airport like JFK or Hartsfield-Jackson, he got Atlantic, Iowa. People often confuse the Atlantic with the ocean, but it's only a small farm town. The airport there had one short runway pressed between endless rows of corn. Day workers went home at 5 p.m., but the tower stayed open until 4 a.m. Many roads crossed the sky above us, so a broken plane might need to drop in at any moment. My uncle sat alone in the glass room at the top, while a guard named Joe slept downstairs by the empty ticket desks. Most hours were silent. He passed long nights by reading thick paperbacks and working crossword puzzles. He also spent many nights whispering on the phone to my aunt. People like to say air traffic control is brutal on the nerves. In Atlantic, he was bored. Almost the whole time. Only once in a while did a tiny Cessna call from the dark and ask for help to land. That quiet routine rolled on until the middle of February 1979. On February 20th, the wind howled through the flat fields, yet there was no snow. He was scheduled to keep watch until closing. No flights were on the board, so he expected nothing but boredom. At 1 a.m., a small Cessna radioed from about 30 miles north. A heavy storm over Omaha forced the pilot to search for a safer strip. My uncle pulled out his binoculars, checked visibility, and started guiding the craft down. The landing looked rough in the crosswind, yet the wheels touched without trouble. He raised the glasses for one more look and froze. A woman was walking up the runway. She wore a thin summer dress, no coat, no shoes, as if they were warm. It was below freezing. Worse, nobody could explain how she reached the middle of an active strip in the first place. Puzzled, my uncle grabbed the microphone and called the Cessna. "Do you see a woman on the runway?" The pilot sounded calm but surprised and stepped out to check. In the binoculars, my uncle watched him approach her, speak, and lean forward as she brought her mouth close to his ear. They stayed that way for 10 long seconds, neither person moving. Then the pilot snapped upright, spun, and sprinted back to his plane. The propeller spun to life. My uncle barked over the radio ordering him to wait, but the pilot ignored every call. The little plane raced down the strip and climbed into the night. Static filled the radio. In the hiss, he caught pieces of words, then one clear command: "Run." The signal went dead. He leaned back, trying to make sense of what he had heard, and then remembered the woman. When he raised the binoculars again, she was facing the tower, 200 yards away. Her eyes were open so wide they looked painful. With no hint of snow beneath her feet, she started running straight at him. He had weathered 6 years in Vietnam and thought fear no longer owned him. Yet something about that figure sprinting through the night sent ice through his chest. He called Joe the guard, but no answer came. He glanced down, just in time to see the front door of the tower slam open. Instinct pushed him toward the small bathroom beside the radar racks. He locked himself in. Outside, chaos exploded, equipment crashing, drawers slamming, the quick thump of feet. Once a violent bang struck the bathroom door so hard the handle shook. Then, total silence. Settled, he stayed hidden until dawn's orange light leaked under the door. At 7:45, The day controller, Clark, arrived to curse loudly and opened the door for him. The control room looked wrecked. Radio panels lay torn from their mounts. Screens were smashed. Paper covered every inch of the floor. Police took statements and shook their heads. Repairs lasted 11 days. Joe was fired for sleeping on duty. Cameras were discussed, but not installed right away. My uncle convinced himself that the intruder must have been a mentally ill woman from a nearby town. The story grew weaker in his mind until it felt half real, half nightmare. He returned on March 4th. Nights stayed calm through the rest of February and into early March. Snow kept falling. One evening near the end of another shift, a private jet called from 50 miles out. Turbulence and ice forced them to seek an immediate landing. The jet was larger than anything the Atlantic Strip usually handled, yet emergencies bent the rules. He gave clearance and watched the snow swirling outside the glass. Then, like a ghost, she appeared again. She stepped onto the far end of the runway barefoot as before, the thin dress fluttering against white flakes. Somehow, her face pointed right at him, her eyes still stretched wide. Did not blink. He realized that in the earlier encounter she had never closed them once. 2 full minutes passed, and she never let those lids drop. He ordered the jet to hold altitude, but the pilot refused. They could not stay up in the rough air. He granted permission, heart pounding, knowing the woman now stood only 100 feet from the tower door. Against orders, he ran downstairs and locked the outside handle, then hurried back to his console. From the window, the runway looked empty. Maybe she had already slipped away. The jet announced final approach. At that instant, something crashed against the downstairs door. Metal squealed. He stared at the radio, because looking anywhere else felt impossible. Heavy steps climbed the tower stairs, each footfall angrily loud, as though someone slammed the sole into the metal with purpose. He kept his voice leveled and cleared the jet to land. Behind him, the office door creaked open. Every part of him wanted to run, yet he could not even turn his head. Cold breath brushed his neck. He felt lips stop an inch from his ear. A whisper slid out, "Come down to the field." The tone was not loud, but carried thick anger. Colder than the winter wind outside. The jet touched down safely and began to taxi. The breath faded. The footsteps retreated, rapid at first, then gone. He forced himself to turn, saw the empty doorway, and managed to call the guard. Together, they searched every floor. No sign of her. Officers arrived to comb the tower, the runway, and the corn beyond the wire fence. They found a single line of bare footprints leading from the field to the tower. No prints returned to the field. Snow kept falling, soft enough to record new marks, yet nothing else appeared. He feared people would believe he had been drinking on duty. He felt sure the woman was real, not a ghost, though he could not explain how she moved or why. With no real proof, he kept most of the details to himself. Spring came early that year. By April, the snow melted, the green stalks poked up in the fields. He convinced himself the horror had died with winter. On a warm night in late April, the freight carrier voiced trouble with an engine. They needed to drop fast. He guided them down, confident again, until motion on the tarmac stole his focus. There she was under the yellow floodlights. Skin gray now, dress hanging in shreds. Her hair clung wet to her cheeks, though rain had not fallen for days. A fuel truck driver stood frozen near his cab. She touched his sleeve, whispered, and the driver stumbled back, climbed into the cab, and sped from the grounds. The truck's horn wailed across the flat land, fading inside corn rows. My uncle called Joe's replacement. The new guard was out inspecting a gate. Alone once more, he felt the tower vibrate as the woman began to climb the iron stairs on the outside of the shaft. The steps were bolted to the wall like a fire escape. He heard the clang of bare feet on steel. The freight carrier's pilot kept talking, asking for final corrections. My uncle delivered instructions in a thin breath, while looking up at the ceiling hatch that opened to the outer platform. Each clang grew louder, until he knew she was a step away. The hatch lifted, wind rushed in, yet it seemed weaker than the chill already inside the room. Her head appeared first, a tilted, eyes even wider than before. She crawled through the opening on hands and knees. Skin blue from cold, though the air was mild. As she stood, she never looked at the equipment or the lights. She looked only at him. The freight plane touched down with a roar that rattled glass. The woman flinched, turned, and walked across the room. Her bare foot pressed onto a splintered screen and sliced open, but she did not slow. Blood left small circles behind her. She climbed onto the opposite sill and stepped out onto nothing, falling past the windows and disappearing into the dark. Officers and medics came after the plane had parked. They searched under the tower with flashlights. There was no body, no blood beneath the windows, and no drag marks. Only the spots of blood inside the control room proved she had stood there at all. Those stains never washed out completely. Maintenance painted over them, but the dark shape always bled through. My uncle finished his story by saying he served at that airport for 6 more months before transferring to Idaho. He never saw the woman again. Sometimes on nights when sleep will not come, he still hears the thin clang of feet on a metal stair and feels cold breath on his skin. He wonders if the woman was flesh or something older, something that borrowed a human shape because it helped her move closer to whoever happened to look out of a certain glass tower in a lonely field of corn. He admits he will never know. Yet each time winter rolls across the Midwest, he opens the news and checks small-town papers for odd reports. So far, he has found nothing, and that silence haunts him even more. A few years ago, I started working as a flight attendant with a small airline based out of San Diego, California. It was my first real job, and I was excited. The airline mostly handled short flights along the west coast of cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. It seemed perfect for someone like me, fresh out of training and eager to see new places. Everything started normally enough. My shifts were mostly morning flights, which meant early wake-ups but also early evenings. I lived alone in a cozy apartment near Mission Valley, and my routine quickly fell into place. Early mornings, busy afternoons, then quiet evenings at home and winding before an early bedtime. About a month into my job, things took an odd turn. It began subtly. I noticed a passenger, a man in his late 30s named Jonathan, appearing on several of my flights. He was quiet, always polite, and nothing about him initially raised alarms. Frequent flyers were common. It wasn't unusual to see familiar faces on routes like these. So at first, I didn't think much about it. But after seeing him for the 4th time in 2 weeks, always on my specific flights, I began to feel uneasy. Each time, he'd smile politely, say hello, but then watch me quietly from his seat. There wasn't anything inherently threatening about him, but something about his quiet gaze felt intense, almost overly familiar. I tried to shake it off as paranoia. After all, dealing with passengers was part of my job. But soon, his presence seemed less coincidental. On a flight from San Diego to Seattle, I glanced toward his seat halfway through the flight and saw him taking a photo pointed directly at me. When our eyes met, he calmly lowered his phone, smiled, and looked away. The next day on a different flight, I deliberately avoided looking his way. But during beverage service, I caught him glancing over repeatedly. Each time he noticed me looking back, he would quickly avert his gaze. It felt calculated, as though he were testing how much he could get away with. My discomfort grew. I hadn't told anyone about this man yet, and not my colleagues, friends, or family. Part of me was embarrassed. Maybe I was just overreacting. It wasn't uncommon for crew members to attract occasional unwanted attention. But there was something unsettlingly deliberate about Jonathan's behavior. A turning point came a week later during an overnight layover in Portland. It had been a tiring day with multiple flights, and I was looking forward to a peaceful night at the hotel. After checking into the Marriott downtown, I decided to walk to a nearby cafe for dinner. As I stepped onto the street, I glanced casually across the road and froze. Jonathan was standing under a street lamp, seemingly waiting for someone. My heart immediately began to pound. Maybe it was just a coincidence. He was probably a business traveler, after all. But then I recalled he'd been on my earlier flight. Was he following me? Trying to remain calm, I crossed the street in the opposite direction and walked quickly toward the cafe, hoping he hadn't noticed me. Inside, I chose a table far from the windows and kept nervously checking outside. Halfway through my meal, the door opened, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as Jonathan entered. He didn't approach me. Instead, he ordered a coffee, sat at the counter, and casually glanced my way, acknowledging me with a slight nod. My appetite vanished. I quickly paid, left the cafe, and hurried back to the hotel, constantly checking behind me. Thankfully, I didn't see him again that night. But sleep came difficultly. By now, his behavior had crossed the line. I debated reporting him to the airline, but I still felt unsure he hadn't explicitly threatened me or done anything illegal that I could prove. Still, fear had begun to shape my days at work. I found myself constantly scanning passengers' faces and dreading his presence. Weeks went by without seeing him, and I began to relax, convincing myself it had all been my imagination running wild. Then, on a late evening flight from Los Angeles to San Diego, I saw his face again. This time, he was in the front row right next to the galley. I felt trapped throughout the short flight. Jonathan watched my every move openly. It was as if he wanted me to notice, to understand. Wasn't he going away? After landing, I waited until everyone else had exited, trying to avoid confronting him, but he lingered, deliberately taking his time gathering his things. Finally, as he passed me, he leaned slightly closer and said, "Have a good night. I'll see you soon." My blood went cold. His words seemed harmless, but the tone and the intent behind them felt menacing. Once he left, I stood frozen, heart racing. I realized then I couldn't ignore this anymore. I needed to report him. The next day, I spoke with my supervisor, finally sharing everything. Airline security and local police became involved, but they told me there was little they could do without clear evidence or explicit threats. Jonathan hadn't committed a clear crime yet. The airline changed my schedule and took me off flights temporarily, hoping distance would discourage him. It seemed to help, at least at first. Weeks passed quietly. But one night, as I entered my apartment building after grocery shopping, I noticed a folded note slipped under my door. Shaking, I opened it. Inside was a single, neatly printed sentence: "You shouldn't have told anyone." My hands trembled as I stared at the words, realizing with terrifying clarity what this meant. He knew exactly where I lived. I immediately called the police, showing them the note. They investigated, reviewed security footage, but found no clear images of anyone suspicious. Again, I was left with nothing but fear. Eventually, I had no choice but to move apartments, change my contact information, and even request transfers within the airline. Slowly, I tried rebuilding a sense of normalcy. Though the memory haunted me, today, I still look over my shoulder whenever I'm alone, always vigilant, always cautious. The man called Jonathan never showed himself again, but I never shake the feeling he's out there somewhere, patiently waiting.